That's a picture of Dr. Torrey down below, and this is about a shipwreck and a man who rescued 17 people from the shipwreck. Dr. Torrey wrote this. This incident is so remarkable that when I first heard it, it seemed to me that it could not possibly be true. But the man that told it was of such a character that I felt that it must be true because he told it. And yet, I said, I must find out for myself whether that story is true or not. So I went to the librarian of the university where the incident was said to have occurred. And I found out that it was true. The story, as I tell it to you today, is as I got it from the brother of the main actor in the scene. And he's about ready to give the story, but here is one clipping about the event that happened. I'm not going to read that clipping. Continuing with Dr. Torrey's account. About 12 miles from where I live, 12 miles from the city of Chicago, that's where Dr. Torrey was, is the suburb of Evanston. And I got that picture, I think. It's an old postcard of Evanston area. I don't know what that building that is. Where there is a large Methodist university. I think the largest university of the Methodist denomination in America. At all events, a great university. Years ago, before the college had blossomed into a great university, when there were not many students in it, two young country boys came from the state of Iowa, strong, husky fellows, and one of them was a famous swimmer. Early one morning, word came to the college that down on Lake Michigan, just off the shores of Evanston, there was a wreck. It proved to be the Lady Elgin. The college boys, with everybody in town, hurried down to the shores of Lake Michigan. Off yonder, in the distance, they saw the Lady Elgin going to pieces. Ed Spencer, and if you see that drawing down there, it says Edward Spencer and his associates gallantly risking their lives in the surf to rescue the drowning people. So that's a sketch at the time. This happened quite a while ago. Ed Spencer, the famous swimmer, threw off all his superfluous garments, tied a rope around his waist, threw one end to his comrades on the shore, sprang into Lake Michigan, swam out to the wreck, grasped one that was drowning, and gave the sign to be pulled ashore. And again, and again, and again, he swam out and grasped a drowning man or woman and brought them safe to shore, until he had brought to shore a seventh, an eighth, a ninth, a tenth. They had built a fire of logs upon the sand. This isn't probably the location, but you get the idea of a fire on the sand and so on. Ed went and stood by the fire of logs that cold, bleak morning, blue, pinched, trembling, hardly able to stand. He stood before that fire trying to get a little warmth into his perishing members. As he stood there, he turned and looked out over Lake Michigan, and off in the distance near the Lady Elgin, he saw men and women still struggling in the water. He said, "Boys, I am going in again." "No, Ed," they cried. "It is utterly vain to try. You have used up all your strength. You could not save anybody. For you to jump into the lake again will simply mean for you to commit suicide." "Well," he said, "boys, they are drowning, and I will try anyhow." And he started to the shore of the lake. His companions cried, "No, no, Ed, don't try." He said, "I will." And he jumped into Lake Michigan and battled out against the waves and got a hold of a drowning man who was struggling in the water and brought him ashore, and again and again and again, until he had brought in an 11th, a 12th, a 13th, a 14th, and a 15th safe to shore. Again, this is not probably Lake Michigan, but again, you get the example of the fire. Then they pulled him in through the breakers. He could scarcely get to the fire on the beach. And there, trembling, he stood before that fire, trying to get a little warmth into his shivering limbs. As they looked at him, it seemed as if the hand of death was already upon him. Then he turned away from the fire again and looked out over the lake. And as he looked, away off yonder in the distance, a spar rising and falling upon the waves, he looked at it with his keen eyes and saw a man's head above the spar. He said, "Boys, there's a man trying to save himself." He looked again and saw a woman's head beside the man's. He said, "Boys, there's a man trying to save his wife." He watched the spar as it drifted toward the point. He knew that to drift around the point meant certain death. He said, "Boys, I'm going to help him." "No, Ed, you can't help him. Your strength is all gone." He said, "I will try anyway." He sprang into Lake Michigan, swam out wearily toward the spar, and summoning all his dying strength, brought it around the right end of the point to safety. Then they pulled him in through the breakers. Loving hands lifted him from the beach and carried him to his room up to the cottage. They laid him on his bed, made a fire in the grate, and his brother Will remained by to watch him, for he was becoming delirious. As the day passed on, Will Spencer sat looking into the fire. Suddenly, Will heard a gentle football behind him and felt someone touch him on the shoulder. He looked up, and there stood Ed, looking wistfully down into his face. He said, "What is it, Ed?" He said, "Will, did I do my best?" "Why, Ed," he said, "you saved 17. He said, I know it, but I was afraid I didn't do my very best." "Will, do you think I did my very best?" Will took him back to bed and laid him upon it and sat down on his side, by his side. As the night passed, I am told, Ed went into semi-delirium, and Will sat by the bed and held his hand to calm him in his delirium. All that he thought about were the men and women that perished that day. For in spite of all his bravery, many went down that day to a watery grave. Will sat there and held Ed's hand and tried to calm him. "Ed," he said, "you saved 17. He said, "I know it, Will. I know it. But oh, if I could only have saved just one more." Now that's a picture of Ed Spencer, I believe, from the college. And he lived at least 50 more years. If you go back to the previous slide, you can see that he returned to the college 50 years later in 1910. So this was in 1860 that this took place. But this is, he's not as old in this picture. He got married and apparently had children. The Lord Jesus Christ plunged into a baptism of death to rescue many more than 17. He also gave far more than sheer exhaustion, for he gave up his life on that cruel cross to save people like you and me. Jesus said in John 15, and it makes you think of Ed Spencer, greater love, Jesus said, has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And Ed seemed to more or less exemplify that kind of, that's a wonderful love. He was willing to risk his own life to save others. He put his life on the line. But the Lord Jesus gave Ed at least 50 more years to live on earth. Ed married and had children, as I think I said. Ed's maker, however, plunged into something far deeper and horrific. He said, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. And you remember on the cross he said, Tetelestai, it is finished. So he did accomplish the task. He saved me, and he's saved millions. And if Ed is with Jesus now in heaven, it is because Jesus came and rescued Ed Spencer.